On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. It was a risky, even a foolhardy decision. Britain possessed the greatest navy on earth, with more than 650 warships in commission, and was then at the peak of its global power and influence. The United States, by comparison, had just 14 frigates and sloops and not a single ship of the line. To be sure, Britain was engaged in a death struggle with Napoleonic France, and that kept most of her navy in European waters. Still, declaring war against such a power in 1812 was breathtakingly audacious. To explain why the United States did it, we have to go back to the summer of 1805. On October 21st of that year, a British fleet commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson won what was arguably the greatest naval victory in Britain's long history. This was the Battle of Trafalgar. In that battle, Nelson's fleet effectively destroyed the combined navies of both France and Spain off Cape Trafalgar, not far from the Strait of Gibraltar. The victory cost Nelson his life, but it confirmed Britain's undisputed command of the sea. Just 5 weeks later, Napoleon, who now called himself Emperor of the French, won an equally impressive victory on land by defeating the combined armies of both Russia and Austria in the Battle of Austerlitz. Napoleon's triumph on land was as decisive as Nelson's had been at sea, and it confirmed France's near absolute control of the European continent. So now, with the British unchallenged at sea and the French dominant on land, it was difficult for these two mortal foes to confront one another directly. Historians have described this predicament as akin to a confrontation between a tiger and a shark, or perhaps an elephant and a whale, each impressive in its own element, but unable to attack one another. One way they could compete, however, was through economic warfare. Recognizing that, Britain's Privy Council, in a measure clearly directed at the United States, issued an order in council in 1807 declaring that neutral countries would no longer be allowed to trade with France or with French dependencies. Well, two could play at that game. From Berlin, which he had recently occupied, Napoleon announced that France would no longer allow neutral countries to trade with Britain or any of its colonies. And he reinforced that with another announcement from Milan a year later. So even if the tiger and the shark couldn't bite one another, apparently they could both bite the United States. The man in the middle of this conundrum was President Thomas Jefferson. He wanted to remain neutral, to trade peacefully and profitably with both countries. That's what most Americans wanted. But the great powers seemed to be saying, nope, you can't do that. You have to choose. On the one hand, the choice seemed fairly obvious. Because Britain controlled the seas with her enormous navy, she could make her orders stick. Napoleon could make all the declarations he wanted, but absent a navy to enforce them, they were just so many scraps of paper. Moreover, Britain made it clear in other ways that she would not tolerate neutrality in the war. When Denmark asserted its neutrality, the British sent a fleet to Copenhagen, bombarded the city, seized the entire Danish navy of 18 ships of the line and about a dozen frigates. Standing up to Britain might well provoke a similar reaction against the United States. And there was another issue. The Royal Navy was in constant need of manpower to keep its huge maritime force at sea, blockading the French coast, protecting British trade, attacking Copenhagen, and doing everything else a global empire needed or wanted to do. To obtain the manpower it needed, the British often resorted to a practice known as impressment. The concept is pretty simple. According to English law, every able-bodied Englishman owed service to the king. So any seaman could be pressed into the Navy if a king's officer, or more often a petty officer, laid hands on him. In times of special need, press gangs, as they were called, prowled British seaports and raided the pubs for likely prospects. Over time, some former British sailors immigrated to the United States. But as far as the British government was concerned, that did not end a sailor's obligation to the Crown. A Royal Navy warship might compel an American merchantman to heave to, send a boat party on board, and examine the crew. If one of them had a Navy tattoo or a Scottish accent, or maybe he just looked English, he would be pressed into service, literally dragged off the ship to join the crew of a British warship. The number of Americans pressed into the Royal Navy eventually grew into the thousands. One authority puts the total as high as 15,000. One incident in 1807 was especially noteworthy. Despite the growing tension with Britain, Jefferson continued to send American warships to the Mediterranean to keep an eye on Algiers and Tripoli. And in 1807, it was the turn of the frigate Chesapeake. She set out from Norfolk, loaded down with a year's worth of supplies in anticipation of a lengthy deployment. Her senior officer, Commodore James Barron, was not expecting a confrontation. So when the British frigate HMS Leopard hailed him and claimed to have dispatches for him, he stopped and waited for a British officer to row over and come on board. Well, the dispatches turned out to be an order from the Leopard's captain to hand over 4 men, deserters from the Royal Navy, who had shipped on the Chesapeake. Well, Barron wasn't going to allow that and said no. As soon as the British officer left, the Leopard opened fire. Barron was unready for a fight. He managed to get off only 1 shot before he struck his flag. The British officer rowed back over, took the men he wanted, and left. It was a national humiliation, and there were loud calls for something to be done. Barron himself was suspended from the Navy. But how could the United States prevent more such episodes of British high-handedness? Jefferson, angry as he was, believed that going to war would be madness. So instead, he adopted a 2-pronged approach. First, he announced some economic sanctions of his own. Jefferson believed that the United States was effectively self-sufficient. The backbone of the national economy was, in his view, the yeoman farmer on his freehold who grew his own food, sold the surplus to the cities, and either made or bought from domestic manufacturers whatever else he needed. In effect, Jefferson believed that Europe needed America more than America needed Europe. And he sought to demonstrate that by declaring that the United States would simply stop trading with either England or France. That would also end impressment because there would be no American sailors at sea to be pressed into service. Jefferson hoped this would make Britain and France repeal both the Orders in Council and the Berlin and Milan decrees. Jefferson's trade embargo was wildly unpopular, especially in New England, which depended heavily on trade. Many American merchants simply ignored the measure, resulting in widespread smuggling. After 2 years, as he was about to leave office, a disappointed Jefferson repealed the embargo. But the United States did not give up on the idea of economic sanctions. Jefferson's successor, James Madison, tried a new tack. Instead of stopping all trade, Madison declared that merchants could now trade with everyone except Britain and France. Unsurprisingly, the New England merchants simply declared that they were headed for Brazil or Holland and then go wherever they wanted. So that didn't work either. Finally, in 1810, Madison tried a truly Byzantine gambit. Now, this gets a little complicated, so bear with me. Under a new law with the curious name of Macon's Bill No. 2, American merchants were allowed to trade with both England and France, but to encourage one or both of them to repeal their restrictive decrees, the United States pledged that it would cut off trade with the enemy of whichever country repealed its law first. In addition to economic sanctions, Jefferson and Madison wanted to find a practical way to defend the American coast. It was pretty obvious that the United States could not build a fleet capable of fending off a serious British attack, but Jefferson thought it was possible to provide some degree of protection by building scores of small defensive gunboats. The idea was controversial. The champions of a regular seagoing navy thought it was absurd. One good broadside from a ship of the line would blow them all out of the water. On the other hand, there was much to be said for them. They cost only about $5,000 each. Gunboats were only 60 to 80 feet long. Most had only a single mast and, as their name suggested, only one gun, though it was usually a gun of the largest caliber. Built exclusively for harbor defense, they were unlikely to provoke the kind of paranoia in London that had led to the British attack on Copenhagen, and gunboats had proved effective in the Mediterranean, where Preble had used them to raid Tripoli harbor. So when the Barbary War ended in 1805, Jefferson asked Congress for 25 of them to protect American ports and harbors. And 2 years later, after the Chesapeake-Leopard Affair and the British seizure of Denmark's fleet, he asked for 50 more. Eventually, the United States built 172 of them. To Jefferson and his supporters, a gunboat navy was like a naval militia. Just as a militia could be called upon to rally to the colors in times of crisis, gunboats could be stored ashore until a threat emerged, then quickly manned and sent to sea to confront the foe. Most naval historians ridicule the idea of a gunboat navy. They point out that it did not deter or prevent impressment, nor did they convince the British to retract the orders in council. And when the gunboats were called upon to do the one thing they were designed for, protect American harbors, they couldn't do that either, as we shall see. On the other hand, it's not clear that any other naval policy would have been more effective. The root of America's conundrum was simply that it was too weak to stand up to the great powers of Europe. But perhaps there was another way. Between 1810 and 1812, a group of mostly Western and Southern congressmen argued that Britain could be brought to heel by threatening to seize Canada. Some Americans believed that Canada was a natural part of the United States and insisted that now was the time to seize it while Britain was distracted by the war against Napoleon. History has labeled this group of bellicose congressmen the Warhawks. They argued that the vast disparity in naval power between the United States and Britain was irrelevant, that an American army could march into Canada from New York and Ohio and occupy it either as a permanent addition to the United States or as a hostage for British good behavior. Such a campaign, the Warhawks insisted, would not involve the Navy at all. So convinced were the Warhawks that naval forces were irrelevant to the war that they advocated, that in 1811 they actually voted down a proposal to build a dozen new frigates. And only a few months later, in June of 1812, they voted for war. The timing gave the war its name, the War of 1812, though it lasted until 1815. The vote for war was close, 79 to 49 in the House, 19 to 13 in the Senate. Even so, the die was cast. In one of history's many ironies, Napoleon led his 600,000-man army eastward into Russia that same month. In effect, the United States joined the war against Britain at almost the precise moment that Napoleon sealed his future doom by marching on Moscow. The war with Britain began with an American invasion of Canada. It did not go well. Indeed, it was as much farce as disaster. The United States dispatched two armies northward into Canada, one across the Niagara River and another across the Detroit River. When the first army reached the Canadian border, the New York State militia refused to cross it. They had been organized for defense, they insisted, not invasion. They were staying in New York. So that was the end of that. It was even worse on the other front. There, an American army under Brigadier General William Hull crossed the Detroit River into Upper Canada, but Hull became concerned for his supply lines and quickly retreated back into Michigan. A small British army, aided by hundreds of local Indians, followed him, and a panicky Hull surrendered Fort Detroit along with his entire command, an act for which he was subsequently court-martialed and sentenced to be shot, though President Madison commuted the sentence. The conquest of Canada, in short, was a complete bust, and the War of 1812 turned out to be mostly a naval war after all. An American naval squadron of 3 frigates and 2 sloops set out from New York almost the moment war was declared. Commanded by Commodore John Rogers, its goal was to intercept a huge convoy of British ships from Jamaica. Rogers' squadron sailed back and forth across the Atlantic in a cruise that lasted 2 months and never found the convoy. Though news that the Americans had a squadron at sea did encourage the Admiralty to concentrate their forces, and that likely allowed many American merchant ships to return safely to port unmolested. Still, the opportunity to inflict an early defeat on the British was lost. The British quickly established a naval blockade of the American coast, which stifled most U.S. overseas trade. Unable to challenge the blockade, the Americans sent out their few frigates and sloops separately, hoping that they might be able to inflict some damage on Britain's trade and perhaps even win a few victories against individual British warships. British naval officers were generally disdainful of the American Navy. In their view, the Royal Navy was not only quantitatively superior, it was also qualitatively superior. In fact, British frigate captains were eager to fight an American frigate because a ship-to-ship victory over an opponent of equal strength was an almost certain path to promotion. But that was the problem. British and American frigates were not of equal strength. American frigates were substantially larger, more powerfully armed than British frigates, with a much heavier broadside throw weight. The first demonstration of this came early on. On August 19, 1812, exactly 3 days after General William Hull surrendered Detroit to the British, his nephew, Isaac Hull, who commanded the USS Constitution, met the British frigate Guerriere in the North Atlantic. Early in the battle, the Guerriere tried a few ranging shots, and a British officer watching through a long glass saw an 18-pound cannonball bounce off the thick oak side of the Constitution. Tradition has it that he exclaimed, "My God, she's made of iron." She wasn't, of course, but the name stuck, and Old Ironsides she has been ever since. The superior weight of the Constitution's broadside quickly made a wreck of the Guerriere. All three masts on the Guerriere went over the side, and she was unable to maneuver, and the British captain, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, struck his flag. News of this victory was a tonic to American morale, which had been depressed by all the bad news from Canada, and more good news followed. Stephen Decatur, the hero of the war with Tripoli, in command of the frigate United States, outmaneuvered and outfought the British frigate Macedonian off the northwest coast of Africa in October 1812. And 2 months after that, in December, it was the Constitution again, now under William Bainbridge, outslugging the British frigate Java off the coast of Brazil. These were humiliating defeats for the proud Royal Navy. One such loss might be excused as a fluke, but 3 in a row was appalling. The British evened the odds a bit in June of 1813 when James Lawrence, in command of the frigate Chesapeake, sailed out of Boston Harbor to challenge HMS Shannon. This time, the combatants were pretty evenly matched, and the battle was especially bloody, neither captain willing to strike. Even after Lawrence was mortally wounded and lay dying on his own quarterdeck, his last words were, "Don't give up the ship." The words became immortal, even though not long afterward, the British boarded the Chesapeake and captured her. All of these frigate duels were fought in the Atlantic. But U.S. Navy ships fought in the Pacific, too. The most famous of these was the USS Essex, a 36-gun frigate commanded by David Porter. In 1813, Porter took the Essex around Cape Horn and into the Pacific, where he pretty much devastated the British whaling fleet. Eventually, the British sent 2 frigates there to catch him, and in February of 1814, they cornered him in Valparaiso, Chile. They could not attack him in a neutral port, but after a storm blew the Essex out to sea, the 2 British ships followed. Because they had longer range guns, they were able to keep their distance and pound the Essex, killing half her crew. Porter gave the survivors a chance to escape to shore, then he struck his flag. The Americans also sent out swarms of privateers to loot British merchant shipping, as they had done during the Revolutionary War. The number of ships taken by the privateers is unknown, but almost certainly it was more than 1,000, severely impacting the British economy. Significant as that was, however, the most strategically important naval battles of the War of 1812 were not in either the Atlantic or the Pacific. They were on lakes in the American West. Roads were few in the American West, so armies and their supplies had to move on the rivers and the lakes. Following Hull's surrender of Detroit, the British threatened to invade the Ohio Territory, but they needed to control Lake Erie to do it. That reality led to a mini naval arms race as both sides built naval squadrons there. In September of 1813, the 2 squadrons met one another. The commander of the American squadron was 28-year-old Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry. He had been a close friend of James Lawrence, and after Lawrence was killed on board the Chesapeake, Perry named his flagship the Lawrence. He also ordered a sailmaker to create a large blue flag with Lawrence's dying words emblazoned on it: "Don't give up the ship." Perry's other big ship, the Niagara, was commanded by Lieutenant Jesse Elliott, who was miffed that the Navy Department had sent Perry to supersede him. Whether or not that was a factor, when the two fleets met at the Battle of Put-in Bay on September 10, 1813, Elliott held back and kept the Niagara out of the fight. That allowed the British to concentrate their fire on the Lawrence. When she was so badly battered she could no longer fight, Perry did not surrender. Instead, he got into a small boat and had himself rowed over to the undamaged Niagara. There, he sent Elliott off to round up the smaller vessels that had fallen behind and took command of the Niagara himself, sailing her back into the fight. Perry then compelled every ship in the British squadron to surrender, thus securing American control of Lake Erie. And in a quick note dashed off to the Army commander and future President William Henry Harrison, Perry wrote, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Knowing that Perry's victory would compel the British to retreat, Harrison began a campaign to regain Detroit, moved into Canada, defeating the retreating British Army in the Battle of the Thames. In short, Perry's victory on Lake Erie completely reversed the military situation in the Northwest. There was a second freshwater battle on a different American lake almost exactly 1 year later. As in the American Revolution, the British sought to send an army southward from Canada into New York along the axis of Lake Champlain, and as before, the Americans built a naval squadron on the lake to block them. The opposing fleets were comparable in size. Each had 4 large vessels, plus a number of smaller gunboats. The difference in the outcome hinged on the careful plans laid by the American commander, Thomas Macdonough. Before the battle began, Macdonough anchored his ships behind a prominent headland and carefully set out double anchors so that his ships could turn their broadsides in several directions, including, if necessary, all the way around to present their other broadside. Those careful preparations allowed Macdonough to dominate the battle, and so, as on Lake Erie, an American naval victory compelled the British Army to retire. These two contests on freshwater lakes, small as they were the most strategically significant naval battles of the war, certainly more important than any of the more dramatic and far more famous frigate duels. The Americans prevailed because the British could not move their huge saltwater navy onto the lakes of the American West. Indeed, as the war lengthened, the British increased their domination of salt water. In the summer of 1814, a British fleet entered the Chesapeake Bay, brushed aside the flotilla of American gunboats, and landed an army in Maryland. The British defeated an American militia force at the Battle of Bladensburg and then marched into Washington. There they burned several of the public buildings, including the White House, doing so in retaliation for similar damage the Americans had done to York, present-day Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada. After that, the British fleet sailed further up the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore, where they initiated a bombardment of Fort McHenry. Watching it from one of the British warships was Francis Scott Key, who was on board to negotiate a prisoner exchange. The bombardment lasted most of the night, and when the sun came up the next day, the dawn's early light showed that the American flag still flew over the fort. The British fleet called off the campaign and headed back down the bay. Key wrote a poem about it. The United States did not win the War of 1812. The best that can be said is that it did not lose it. But that was enough. By 1815, the issues that had provoked the war had all been resolved. In fact, the British had repealed the Orders in Council even before the war began, though the Americans did not learn that until after hostilities had begun. In addition, Napoleon's defeat, first at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, and then, and finally, at Waterloo in 1815, meant that the British no longer needed to maintain such a huge navy, and that ended the need for impressment. And so on Christmas Eve in 1814, in Ghent, in modern-day Belgium, British and American negotiators agreed to end the war, essentially restoring the status quo antebellum. It was almost like saying, never mind. But even if the United States did not win the War of 1812, it felt like a win. The arrival of news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived in Washington hard on the heels of news that Andrew Jackson had won a victory over the British at New Orleans in January of 1815. Canada remained British, but the victory at New Orleans, the memory of those early frigate victories in 1812, and the twin successes on the Western Lakes all combined to leave Americans feeling like winners. The United States had taken on the greatest naval power in the world, had held its own, and emerged largely unscathed.